Take your career to the next level. The University of South Florida, St. Petersburg is offering a master's degree in digital journalism and design. Do the entire program from home and complete it in as little as 1 year. For more information, email journalism@usf.edu or call 727-873-4544. The cost is reasonable, the experience is invaluable. From the worldwide leader in journalism, truth, and democracy, this is the Poynter Report Podcast, a joint production between the Poynter Institute and the Department of Journalism and Digital Communication at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. Now here's your host from the Poynter Institute, Tom Jones.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ren LaForme, Managing Editor here at Poynter, filling in for Tom Jones on this special episode of the Poynter Report Podcast, our first episode of Season 4. Joining me as a co-host today is Alex Mahadevan, my good friend, former bandmate, which you can ask us about if you'd like, and Director of MediaWise and also a Poynter faculty member. Alex, welcome back.
Really good to be back.
Sure. No, it's great to have you. Today, we're going to go on a hike through history to look back at an overlooked media and pop culture moment from just over a decade ago. It's one that pioneered a playbook for online movements that can cloak harassment and misinformation under the banner of a higher purpose. That moment that we're talking about today is Gamergate, which was an online firestorm that claimed to be about ethics in video game journalism, but quickly became something much larger. And I should note that this episode is also part of our Poynter 50 project, which marks Poynter's 50th anniversary by revisiting 50 of the most significant media moments and people of the last half century. This is number 15 or 16 or so please I'll join in on that and I'll show you how to get there later. Alex, I was just talking to a colleague about Gamergate, and she said it felt like as I was talking, I was unwrapping a world that she did not know much of anything about, but was fascinated to learn about. And it made me realize that I'm not sure how many people know the history of what happened. So I'm going to toss it to you in a minute to talk about, I guess, what you would call the inciting incident of Gamergate. But I first want to describe the circumstances. And then later on in the podcast, we'll get to what it actually meant for journalism. So let's start by painting a picture. It is late summer 2014. The video games industry is booming, partially because of big blockbuster titles like Grand Theft Auto and Call of Duty, but also because there's been some unprecedented growth of video games into the mainstream, right? The Nintendo Wii was a massive success, and everyone and their brother and mother and family was playing it. Apps were starting to come into their own, and all kinds of people were playing games on their phones. And by some numbers, the video games industry was 3 times or more bigger than the film industry, which I don't think a lot of people know much about. But there's some friction growing in this culture, right? I don't know if I'd call myself a former gamer myself, but as a person who played a lot of video games, people who kind of grew up feeling like outcasts because of their love for games, which used to be sort of a niche thing, were suddenly sharing space with people who didn't have that background. And that tension got a little ugly at times. And there were video games journalists covering some of that clash of cultures. And so that, I think, sets the scene for the start of Gamergate, which I hope I could toss it to you to describe.
Yeah, well, you set the stage wonderfully there, Ren. So thank you so much for teeing it up really well. So you have this overwhelming tension in our culture right now between self-described gamers, normies, whatever you might call them, as well as this sort of groundswell of indie game developers, many of whom were people of color. They were women. They were generally not seen as the hardcore gaming demographic, and they were putting out some really cool stuff. And so the inciting incident was the ex-boyfriend of one of these indie game developers, Zoe Quinn. He put out a post claiming that she had slept with a gaming journalist, and it was in exchange for a good review of the game that she was putting out. I will say right off the bat, it did not happen. It was thoroughly debunked quickly by a few different sources. but it absolutely exploded because it sort of crystallized this idea of, well, this group has come into our culture. They are trying to co-opt it with their. Back then, we didn't use the word. They didn't use the term woke, but they used the term social justice warrior or SJW, as we might say a few times. So they're coming in, they're co-opting our culture, they're taking over, and they're doing it by unethical means. And it sort of exploded into a treatise against journalism, games journalism, feminists. Really anyone who was seen outside of that hardcore gaming community. And it snowballed from there into what many would consider sort of the first huge volley in what is now almost a daily online culture war that we see.
And that took the form of a lot of things, right? But I think the thing that journalists tend to focus on and what happened during that time was there was just a tremendous spate of harassment happening, right? Like someone would post on Twitter and they'd be flooded with people saying all kinds of things. People were being doxxed, which is when people post your home address and information online. People, I think, were being swatted for perhaps some of the first times, which is when they send a SWAT team into your house to knock down the door and do whatever they do. So this was sort of this online argument that quickly had offline repercussions.
Yeah, in very much in the same way nowadays that we see online disinformation and online harassment spill over regularly into real life. It started happening back then, and it was incredibly surprising because there was always trolling. I mean, 4chan, which we can talk a little bit more about, but this anonymous message board filled with some of the most heinous stuff you could ever imagine. They always really trolled people online, but this was the first time where you started to see these real world effects. And some of the people targeted in the Gamergate controversy had to, like, for example, move out of their homes because their addresses were posted online and they were getting swatted every other day. So that's another. We'll talk, I think, in this conversation a lot about the parallels between the online culture wars and politics now and back then. And that is one of the parallels is like, this online targeting can quickly spill over into the real world.
So back to Gamergate, a lot of what I heard back then, I participated in a society professional journalist event with some, I don't know, top folks in Gamergate. A lot of what I heard back then was a couple of complaints. One, I would broadly describe as, games journalism is unethical. These reporters have all these conflicts of interest, some of which were real, some of which perhaps were not. I also heard, a lot of consternation about the Gawker media universe, which I would hazard people to. I would tell people to not conflate journalism with what Gawker was doing, which was sort of its own thing, and certainly had value in the marketplace, but I don't think sort of bound itself by the traditional restraints of mainstream journalism. And so when you look back on this, did they have any sort of points about there being massive problems with ethics in games journalism?
Well, it might be good to even like zoom out a little bit wider there on sort of what the fragmented media ecosystem started to look like. So this was 2013, 2014. We're coming out of the recession. We're like really like finally full steam ahead with our economy. And you see just an incredible amount of easy money in digital ad revenue, right? Am I correct? And would you characterize the situation?
It was a
like
windfall time. Yeah. A very brief windfall time.
Yeah. It's wild to think back to those times, but there was so much easy money in digital ad revenue, which was basically get someone to click on something or get someone to watch a video and you get paid. On YouTube, for example, this was, I think, before the partner program. So it really was like through Google AdSense. Like if you get a ton of views on your video and people watch it for a long time, you're going to get paid really quickly. So you had this sort of this media ecosystem online where you saw blogs, you saw things like Gawker that were coming into this space where, in order to get paid, you had to get clicks, and there was a lot of money in it. So I think at times someone like Gawker filled this sort of vacuum where it's like they are putting out a lot of really inflammatory stuff, some of it really, really good journalism, but in a different way than you would have seen, the New York Times, the Washington Post cover something, covering it very like embedded in the culture, very much like trying to get people to come and see what they're reporting on. Same goes for the YouTubers at the time. So I think the people in the gaming community, when they started throwing around the excuse about, oh, we are targeting these people and this is all about ethics and journalism, I think that is a good background to have, is that there were a lot of non-traditional journalism entities coming out of this and personalities who maybe were not necessarily bound by the traditional ethics of journalism. So what you saw happen is you saw some of these new media voices being conflated with journalism as a whole. And so, this is a little bit of background. Now, to answer your question directly, there has been a lot of evidence since and a lot of chatter at the time that the biggest voices in this who were screaming, this is about ethics in games journalism, knew that it wasn't actually about ethics in game journalism. It was about targeting people outside of the gaming community who had maybe come into the gaming community, people they didn't like. It was an excuse. It was cover for harassment. But it is good to note that, underneath all of that, there was a very, very small kernel of truth in that there was this new online media ecosystem that, at times operated out of the traditional bounds of ethics in journalism.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because our thesis for all this Gamergate stuff is that it pioneered sort of tactics that were picked up by later movements like Pizzagate, Stop the Steal, things like that. And I think that in the center of those two, maybe not, I'm not going to like wash it all away, but at the center of those is a lot of media illiteracy, which is sort of your expertise.
Yeah. I mean, I think also, the games community undercovered traditionally. I mean, there were, I think you and I were probably both subscribers to like Nintendo Power and stuff like in the 90s or whatever.
Alex, I walked around with my backpack entirely full of PlayStation magazines, and I would sit in study hall and put them all out in front of me like I was some type of nerd library. I did not make a lot of friends in 8th grade. I have to tell you that.
It's a huge surprise, Ren. Also not surprising that you were a PlayStation guy, Nintendo Xbox guy here. But, back to the point about this media literacies, I think a lot of people who are really embedded in this community and gamers, and even like at the time, there were sort of these new kind of creators in the gaming space. I think they didn't really interact with the news traditionally. And when Gamergate exploded and you started seeing the disinformation online spill over and start affecting people in real life, and traditional news outlets started to take notice and cover what was happening, there was this clash, and you saw this group of people who maybe were not used to traditional media covering them, and they just didn't understand necessarily how media worked, and just because a topic was being covered and certain people were being interviewed, it didn't mean your entire community was being sort of thrown under the bus or whatever. So I think some of the conflict that came out of that, and that like churlishness toward journalists and journalism came due to, like you said, media illiteracy. And I will say, I don't want to put the onus on everyone. Like it's your job to be media literate. It isn't. This is a group of people who were maybe overlooked by the mainstream media for a long time. So.
That was a common point that you saw at the time too. Is hey, the mainstream media doesn't cover us. And as I noted, it was a huge industry. And so you've got these people this culture who says, hey, we don't get the coverage that we're looking for. You don't take us seriously. Suddenly they're getting a ton of coverage about all these bad things that are happening. And they're already sort of on the defensive because they feel like, my identity is being threatened by all this change that's happening within the industry. And it just erupts into this absolute, explosion online that goes offline. We're going to talk a bit more about how journalists covered it or didn't cover it and some of the repercussions in a moment. But first, let's take a break and we'll be right back.
Hey, everybody, if you like this podcast, can I ask you a favor? I'd love to make sure you also subscribe to the Poynter Report newsletter, where I bring you the latest news and commentary about the media industry every weekday. If you're already signed up, thanks a lot. But you should also check out some of the other great newsletters we have at poynter.org/newsletters. My colleague, Kristen Hare, focuses on the local news scene in communities all across the country every Wednesday with Local Edition. My editor, Ren LaForme, gives you the roundup of the best media stories from Poynter every Friday in his Open Tabs newsletter. And if you care about misinformation, fact-checking, getting to the truth, the Factually newsletter has you covered. And if you're looking for some great ways to improve your skills in writing, leadership, or ethics, our weekly training digest has you covered. Just go to poynter.org/newsletters and sign up today.
Okay, we're back on the Poynter Report podcast. I'm managing editor Ren LaForme, and I'm here with Alex Mahadevan, director of MediaWise and a Poynter faculty member. In a moment, I want to get to the impacts of Gamergate and how it was covered and how it sort of set the playbook for other movements. But first, I wanted to take a beat to remind everyone, if you're watching or listening, please give us a like. You can listen to us on Apple or Spotify, or you can watch us on YouTube. I don't know why you would want to look at me, but you can choose to do so if you'd like. Please subscribe. Please leave a review or share with a friend, maybe someone who's really into Call of Duty. It would help a lot. And while I have you, please check out our Poynter 50 project on poynter.org/Poynter. You know what? Just go to poynter.org and use the main navigation. It's easiest to find it there. So Alex, let's talk about the coverage of Gamergate, which we were kind of getting into before the break. How did journalists cover it and what made it so challenging to cover?
Journalists had a lot of trouble covering it. I mean, I don't want to, again, I feel like I'm both sidesing everything. It was just such a difficult thing to cover. But I think mainstream journalists did a really poor job of covering what was happening during Gamergate. And the reason is they were dealing with these communities of totally anonymous people on these message boards where I would think many of these journalists had no experience on. They didn't know how like the little hash numbers worked at the top or how to track people across any of these anonymous platforms. They were dealing with people with, Kirby and Sonic avatars. And so you had this incredibly disorganized, but at the same time sort of organized online movement. There was no leader. It's not like they were putting out press releases saying, we're going to be meeting at so-and-so City Hall to talk about this. So it was really difficult to monitor. It was sort of like this Wild West type situation online. And I think most journalists just did not have the tools to monitor online spaces, let alone some of the most toxic online spaces. So it was an anonymous movement, very, very much leaderless. The other thing I also want to point out too is like the main players in this, and a lot of the people in the gaming community also weren't even going to mainstream outlets for coverage of Gamergate. They were going to YouTube and YouTubers. And it sort of goes back to that ad dollar question that I brought up earlier, and that there was a lot of money to be made on YouTube with incredibly one-sided coverage. So you have this incredibly polarized echo chamber type situation, the anonymous nature of it. So it was just very difficult for a journalist who might be used to just, interviewing folks after a meeting or something to stay on top of.
Yeah, there was that element missing. I mean, journalists pride themselves on like shoe leather work, right? This is the ultimate type of journalism. You go knock on someone's door, you get their face, you get their name, you verify all of their stuff just by seeing them. And so the idea of reaching out to somebody, via like a Twitter DM when they're not using their real name, and as you note, they're using like a video game character as their avatar, it didn't feel like journalism to a lot of journalists, right? It somehow feels lesser than, because this is not how this is supposed to work. And you brought up another good point, which is I think the Gamergate world sort of spun up its own media infrastructure pretty quickly. I remember there being hours-long YouTube videos that dissected, the initial blog post that set things off, and all these other incidents that they highlighted as lapses of ethics in game journalism. And they almost didn't need mainstream journalism to cover it, because they were getting a steady diet of coverage on their own. It was almost feeding back into itself. And I think that is something that we've seen a number of times since then. This was, in my mind, the first time that we saw that.
To talk about parallels to today, I mean, geez, like I have a bunch of fake Twitter accounts that I use to sort of, I follow a bunch of accounts on one side or the other to just see what my feed looks like. And I mean, it's like you would think I'm living in a completely different reality with some of the echo chambers that exist online just based on what you like and what you follow. And think about YouTube back then. I mean, we talk about the rabbit hole, and when you watch something and get recommended to watch something similar, I mean, there was a rabbit hole. The money was flowing like crazy to these creators. They were incentivized to play to their audience. So it was just, I mean, I just see so many parallels between what happened then and what happened now. I mean, now it's like, think about the Cracker Barrel issue that we just went through. You know, Cracker Barrel went to change their logo, and you had a lot of people on one side saying they were changing it because it was woke. I go to my Twitter feed, for one of my accounts, and all I see is all of the reasons why Cracker Barrel is trying to get rid of its, try to alienate its original audience by changing its logo to a new woke logo. You know what I mean? Like now we see this almost every week, and it plays out in the same exact way, where you have these two realities that are just completely divergent from each other.
Yeah, so that's a great point. So all these things are happening, right? There's a number of things that make Gamergate unattractive or challenging for traditional mainstream journalists to cover. Gamergate spins up its own media infrastructure, and it's this perfect storm of all of this stuff is happening, and it just made the media look inept, that they could not get their hands around how to cover it. Did we learn anything from that, do you think? Do you think that journalists today are more adept at covering online movements than they were at Gamergate?
Some, yes. I mean, I think of a lot of the really good open source intelligence reporting that I see, from outlets like Bellingcat, Wired. I mean, I think a niche has developed in monitoring online communities that leaves us a little bit more prepared for things like this. Mm-hmm. But I still think, for the most part, if you look at, sort of a mainstream political reporter did not forecast the rise of someone like Laura Loomer, an incredibly toxic online person who handcuffed herself to Twitter's headquarters when she was kicked off for being racist, yada, yada. Now she's an incredibly powerful person in the administration. And I think the mainstream political journalists were not prepared for how much these sort of unsavory online characters that some of which were involved in Gamergate would become part of our sort of mainstream political reality. So I think you see lessons going unheeded, if that's a word, when you watch like the rise of someone like Laura Loomer. However, there is really great work happening on reporting on online spaces. You think of people like Drew Harwell, Kate Conger, Taylor Lorenz, very talented at covering these online communities and starting to see some of these culture wars simmering before they start spilling out into the real world. So while I think journalism as a whole maybe did not learn a good lesson from Gamergate, there's a lot of really talented journalists who are doing really, really good work on it.
Yeah, it still feels so underreported to me. I mean, like the folks you noted are doing great work. I would add Will Summer, who's now at the Bulwark. He's stellar at covering these online spaces. But I mean, that's a handful of journalists among so many, and there are still. I fear that what follows, Gamergate, Pizzagate, Stop the Steal, is starting to bubble up out there, and we're going to miss it because we don't have the skills yet. And I think it's more challenging now too, because so many of these social networks have removed the tools that help us monitor these spaces, right? Like CrowdTangle used to be a big one for tracking what was happening on Twitter and Facebook and the like, and Facebook's fact-checking infrastructure, which has been dismantled in the wake of the last election. I fear that we still don't have enough journalists to cover these spaces who have the skills to cover these spaces, and that the tools that we need to do so are being decimated. Does that seem fair?
It is, and I feel like I've tried to be a bit of an optimist as we've been talking about this, but this is where I fall a little bit more on the doomer side of things, because what you brought up about Meta taking apart its fact-checking program is like also fact checkers were so talented at monitoring these online spaces. I mean, that's where like I would stay tuned into PolitiFact's Slack channel just to see like what the craziest rumor was that was coming out. So then I could try to like report on it or get my MediaWise team fact-checking network to look at it. And so that infrastructure has been dismantled in the place of community notes, which is when you as a user, any old person, has to go in and fact check their own feed. And it's like, what is a regular person going to fact check? They're going to fact check everything that they do not like. So like, I talk about how polarization and echo chambers were such an important part of Gamergate, and it's only getting more entrenched and more, it's only becoming more part of our online experience. Now, literally, like fact-checking infrastructure has fallen to individuals who are going to be fact-checking based on their own political beliefs. And so I only see our online experience getting more polarized and more toxic. And, I think the trouble with, like, I'm also in an echo chamber because I will read everything that Will Sommer writes, or, Charlie Warzel. I'll read every newsletter I get from Charlie Warzel at The Atlantic. But how many regular people are reading that? How many normies? Like, if you go out in the street and ask them, like, about the latest kind of culture war thing simmering, it's always too late, like everyone knows about Cracker Barrel right now, but that could have been exposed as more BS ahead of time if more people knew how to cover these online spaces. And another thing I don't want to get too off task here, but I have to bring up Christopher Rufo, who is someone who has helped drive. He helped drive the complete transformation of New College, which is a college in my backyard where I grew up in Sarasota, and it was a super like liberal. They used to walk around with no shoes on there, and it has done a complete 180. It has been de-wokeified, as they said. There were literally like scores of books that were like thrown out of the library. Professors have left, and Rufo has constantly bragged about how good he is at manipulating the online conversation and tricking journalists into covering his point of view as if it is sort of the mainstream. And it's someone who absolutely learned how to manipulate the online discourse out of Gamergate. And I don't know if he's necessarily specifically discussed that, but every time I watch Rufo get a fringe belief into the New York Times or the Washington Post, and then he brags about it online, I'm thinking, wow, we really have not learned any lessons from Gamergate, have we? Because there is no context. There is no context to the communities that he's a part of, the ideas that he espouses, where they come from, these fringe online communities. And so it's just that is an example that sticks in my mind when we talk about, the difficulties of covering these online spaces when we just do not have the resources as journalists. That's where I fall on the doomer side of things, because we talk about swatting and doxing. This is where we see this online discourse completely change the course of a very well-respected university in a town that I love.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to end it, right? The Gamergate, its criticisms of journalism might not have warranted it a place on our list of the 50 most momentous moments or people in journalism over the last 50 years, but the outcomes, the things that people outside journalism learned about how to manipulate online discourse, the fact that journalists didn't seem as a whole to learn a whole lot about covering these movements, that I think is what places it on the list of these 50 moments. And that is what I fear will be the lasting impact of Gamergate. When we write the storybooks of history, people will look to this as the most obvious of foreshadowing that we entirely whiffed on.
Yeah, it's, I mean, there could be a Gamergate every week now. I mean, the culture war, everything that happens has to fall on one side or the other of the culture war. And Gamergate was what started all of that.
Alex, thanks for joining us today. What's your favorite video game?
Skyrim. Yeah, I have to be a normie and say Elden Ring was. I'll go with Skyrim just purely for staying power.
It's been on so many systems. I'm going to go way back to Chrono Trigger.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. That actually makes a lot of sense when I think about it.
Yeah, it always feels like a dig when you say something to me, Alex. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Thanks to USF for hosting our podcast. If you like this episode, remember to like it, subscribe. We're on all the systems, all the platforms. You could probably listen to us on an Xbox if you wanted. Thanks so much for joining us, and take care.
Thank you for listening to the Poynter Report Podcast. The podcast is produced by the Department of Journalism and Digital Communication at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg. Executive producers are Elliot Weiser and Ren LaForme. Our producers are Tom Jones and Caden Knowles. Production assistant is Ariel Mankus. And our director is Christopher Campbell. And a special thank you to Neil Brown and Dr. Mark Walters.